They stripped her of her coat in the dead of winter and told her she was too weak to survive the night. Everyone in the Silverleaf Pack believed Aara Vance was nothing a runt, a burden, a waste of space. But they were wrong, because that freezing night in the mountains didn't kill her. It led her to him. A dying beast, bleeding out in the snow, a monster, so feared that entire armies fled his shadow. She thought she was saving a stray dog. She didn't know she was saving the Alpha King, and that one act of kindness would bring her former tormentors to their knees. This is the story of how the unwanted girl became the Queen of Wolves. The wind didn't howl. It screamed. It tore through the thin, threadbare fabric of Aara Vance's dress, biting into her skin like 1,000 invisible needles. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice in Alpha Marcus Sterling's eyes. You have been a drain on the Silverleaf Pack since the day your parents died. Marcus boomed his voice, echoing off the mahogany walls of the packhouse meeting hall. He sat on his leather throne, swirling a glass of amber whiskey, looking at Aara as if she were a stain on his floor. You cannot shift. You cannot hunt. You barely have enough strength to scrub the floors. Winter is here, Aara. Food is scarce, and I am tired of feeding a mouth that offers nothing in return. Aara shivered, standing alone in the center of the room. The fireplace was roaring just 10 feet away, but she felt none of its warmth. Around her, the high-ranking members of the pack, her neighbors, people she had grown up with, watched with cruel indifference. Some smirked. Others just looked away, cowardly, refusing to meet her gaze. "I work harder than anyone," Aara whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "I tend the gardens. I mend the clothes. I clean the infirmary until my hands bleed. I have never asked for more than my share." Marcus laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over her. "Labor is cheap. Strength is what matters. And you, Aara, are weak. You are a biological failure, a wolf without a wolf." He walked down the steps of the dais, stopping inches from her face. She could smell the expensive cologne he wore, masking the scent of his cruelty. "I have a deal for you," he sneered, lowering his voice so only the front row could hear. "Old Silas needs a warmer for his bed. He's 60 blind in one eye and mean as a rattlesnake. But he's willing to take you. Marry him tonight, and you can stay." A gasp caught in Alara's throat. Silas was known for beating his previous mates. 2 of them hadn't survived the winter. "No," she breathed, stepping back. "I'd rather die." Marcus's face hardened. The amusement vanished. "Then die you shall." He pointed to the heavy oak doors. "Get out. You are rogue now. If you are found on Silverleaf territory by sunrise, my trackers will hunt you down for sport. And take that coat off. It belongs to the pack." The cruelty of it stole the air from her lungs. "It's 10 degrees below zero," she protested, clutching the worn wool coat she'd stitched herself. "It belongs to the pack," Marcus roared, his eyes flashing amber. With trembling fingers, Aara unbuttoned the coat and let it drop to the floor. She stood in her thin grey dress and worn boots. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't cry. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her tears. She turned on her heel, chin held high, and walked toward the door. As she pushed into the biting blizzard, the last thing she heard was the heavy thud of the lock sliding into place behind her. The forest was a white graveyard. The snow was already knee-deep, and the storm was worsening. Aara walked until her feet went numb, then walked until they burned, and finally until she couldn't feel them at all. Every instinct screamed at her to lie down and sleep, but she knew that sleep was death. She headed toward the northern ridge, a jagged, treacherous area of the territory that most wolves avoided because of the rock slides. It was the only place Marcus's patrols were unlikely to check. "I will not die," she muttered through chattering teeth, the mantra keeping her legs moving. "I will not die to please him." After hours of tramping through the snow, she saw it a fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. A cave. She shoved herself into the gap, scraping her arms against the jagged stone, and tumbled into the darkness. It was dry inside, and marginally warmer, sheltered from the biting wind. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, curling into a tight ball to conserve heat. She was alive. She was alone, freezing and exiled. But she was alive. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, a scent hit her. It wasn't the smell of damp earth or stone. It was metallic, heavy. Blood. Aara stiffened. She wasn't alone. Aara scrambled backward, her back hitting the cold stone wall. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the far corner of the cave, something massive shifted. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the floor, deep enough to rattle her bones. It was a wolf. But not just any wolf. Even in the shadows, she could tell this creature was gigantic easily, twice the size of Alpha Marcus. Its fur was pitch black, darker than the cave itself, absorbing the faint light filtering in from the snow outside. Aara froze. A rogue wolf of this size would tear her apart in seconds. She waited for the lunge for the snap of jaws. But it didn't come. Instead, the beast let out a ragged, wet wheeze and slumped back down. The metallic scent of blood was overpowering now. Curiosity warred with fear. Aara was a healer by nature. She had spent years sneaking into the pack infirmary to read the medical journals the doctors threw away. She knew the sound of a dying lung. Slowly, inch by inch, she crawled forward. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, her voice shaking. The wolf's head snapped up. Its eyes were glowing, not the usual yellow or amber of a normal shifter, but a piercing electric violet. They burned with pain and fury. He snarled, exposing teeth the size of daggers. "You're hurt," Aara said softly, stopping just out of biting range. "I can smell the infection." The wolf watched her, his chest heaving. He tried to stand, his massive paws scrabbling against the dirt, but his back legs gave out, and he collapsed with a pained whine that broke Aara's heart. She saw the wound then, a jagged, nasty tear along his flank, oozing dark blood. It looked like he had been slashed by something, sharp silver perhaps. The flesh around it was black and festering. "Silver poisoning," she murmured. "If you don't get that cleaned, you'll be dead by morning." The wolf watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. He seemed to assess her, this tiny, freezing human girl with blue lips and no coat. Aara made a decision. If she was going to die in this cave, she wouldn't die watching another creature suffer. "I need to get water," she told him, standing up slowly. "Don't eat me when I come back." She slipped out of the cave, shivering violently as the wind hit her. She used a hollowed-out piece of birch bark to scoop up clean snow, packing it tight. Then she scoured the nearby tree line. She needed pine resin for an antiseptic and moss to pack the wound. It took her 20 minutes. By the time she returned, her fingers were blue and stiff, but she had a handful of supplies. The wolf hadn't moved. His breathing was shallower. Aara knelt beside him. Up close, he was terrifying. His head was as big as her torso. The power radiating off him was suffocating, an alpha aura so potent it made her dizzy. Yet he lay still as she approached. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. She used her body heat to melt the snow in the bark, washing the wound as best she could. The wolf flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he didn't snap. He squeezed his eyes shut, enduring the pain. Aara worked quickly. She smeared the sticky pine resin over the gash to seal it and packed it with the moss. Then she did something reckless. She tore the bottom hem of her dress, her only layer of clothing, ripping a long strip of fabric to bind the wound. "There," she whispered, tying the knot. "That's the best I can do." She sat back, exhausted. The cold of the cave was seeping into her bones. She hugged her knees to her chest, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Suddenly she felt a shift in the air. The massive black wolf dragged himself closer to her. Aara tensed, but he didn't attack. Instead, he curled his massive body around her, creating a wall of living fur between her and the cold air. He nudged her hand with his wet nose, then laid his heavy head on her lap. Heat radiated from him like a furnace. The warmth stunned her. He was saving her. She had treated his wound, and now he was keeping her from freezing to death. "Thank you," she whispered, burying her frozen fingers into his thick, soft fur. For the first time in her life, Aara Vance felt safe. She drifted off to sleep in the arms of a monster, unaware that the creature resting his head on her knees was Caelan Thorn, the Alpha King, the ruthless, the wolf who had slaughtered entire packs for looking at him. Wrong. And he was purring. Aara woke to the sensation of sandpaper rasping against her cheek. Her eyes flew open, panic seizing her chest for a split second before memory washed over her. The cave, the storm, the wolf. She was alive, and she was warm. The massive black wolf was awake, his head raised, watching her with those unnerving, electric violet eyes. He had been licking her face, a rough, deliberate grooming that wolves usually reserved for their pups or their mates. Aara sat up groaning as her stiff muscles protested. The storm outside had broken. A beam of pale winter sunlight sliced through the crack in the rocks, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "You're awake," she croaked, her voice raspy from dehydration. The wolf chuffed a low sound in his throat. He nudged her hand with his wet nose, pushing her toward the entrance of the cave. I know, Aara sighed, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "I need to check your wound." She knelt beside him. The makeshift bandage she'd torn from her dress was soaked through with blood, but the bleeding had slowed. When she peeled back the fabric, she gasped. The black, festering edges of the wound had receded significantly. The silver poisoning was retreating. "You heal fast," she murmured, impressed. "Faster than any alpha I've ever seen." The wolf stared at her, his gaze intense. If she didn't know better, she'd swear he looked smug. "Don't get cocky," she scolded, gently retying the bandage. "You're still too weak to hunt, and I'm starving. If we don't eat, we both freeze tonight." Aara stood up, smoothing down her ruined dress. She had no coat, no weapon, and no skills. But she had desperation. "Stay here," she commanded the beast, pointing a finger at his nose. "If the Silverleaf Patrol comes, stay quiet. They'll kill you for your pelt." The wolf let out a low, menacing growl at the mention of the patrol, his lips peeling back to reveal those dagger-like fangs. It wasn't a growl of fear, it was a promise of violence. "I mean it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, stay." She squeezed through the fissure and out into the blinding white world. The forest was silent, buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Aara moved slowly, her boots crunching softly. She knew she couldn't catch a deer or a rabbit by running. She had to be smarter. She remembered the lessons her father had taught her before he died, before the pack demoted her to a servant. Use the land, Aara. The land provides, if you listen. She found a cluster of heavy stones near a rabbit run. With freezing fingers, she set a crude deadfall trap, using a sturdy stick and a piece of twine she'd unravelled from her hem. It was clumsy, but it was all she had. She waited. Hours passed. The cold began to gnaw at her again, turning her fingers clumsy and numb. Then she heard it. Not the snap of a twig, but voices. Aara threw herself behind a thick pine tree, burying herself in a snowdrift, her heart hammered against the frozen ground. "I'm telling you, Vaughn, she's dead," a rough voice laughed. "No one survives a night like that without a coat. She's a popsicle by now." Aara peeked around the bark. 50 yards away, 2 men in grey winter gear were trudging through the snow. She recognized them instantly. Vaughn the Pack's beta, a sadistic man who enjoyed breaking fingers for fun, and Drive, a low-level enforcer. "Marcus wants proof," Vaughn grunted, spitting tobacco into the snow. "He wants her head. Says it's a warning to anyone else who thinks they can be useless." Aara clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. They weren't just exiling her. They were hunting her. Marcus wanted her dead to make a point. "Check the caves up on the ridge," Vaughn ordered. "If she crawled in there to die, I want to drag her out before the bears get her." They were heading straight for the fisher. Straight for the wolf. Ilara's blood ran cold. If they found the wolf, they would kill him. He was injured, unable to fight off 2 fully shifted warriors, and it would be her fault. She looked at the trap she had set. Empty. She looked at the men moving closer to the hideout. Do something, her mind screamed. Aara grabbed a rock the size of a grapefruit. She stepped out from behind the tree, fully visible, and hurled the rock at a tree trunk 20 yards to her left, away from the cave. Crack! The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent woods. Vaughn's head snapped toward the noise. "Did you hear that? Over there!" The enforcer pointed. "Someone's moving." "Hey!" Aara screamed, her voice shrill and terrified. "Help me!" She didn't wait. She turned and ran, not toward the cave but away from it, leading them into the deep valley. "There she is!" Vaughn roared. "Get her!" Aara ran until her lungs burned. She scrambled over fallen logs and tore through brambles that sliced her bare arms. She could hear the heavy thud of boots behind her gaining ground. They were faster, stronger. She reached the edge of a frozen creek and slipped. She went down hard, her ankle twisting with a sickening pop. She tumbled onto the ice, sliding to a halt in the center of the creek. "Gotcha!" Vaughn sneered, stepping onto the bank. Aara tried to stand, but her leg collapsed. She scrambled backward on the ice, tears finally spilling over. "Please, Vaughn, just let me go." Vaughn smirked, pulling a long hunting knife from his belt. Marcus said, "Bring her head. Nothing personal, Runt. Just business." He stepped onto the ice. Then the world exploded. A black blur launched from the ridge above, clearing 20 feet of air in a single bound. It hit Vaughn with the force of a freight train. There was a wet crunch, a scream that was cut short, and then silence. Aara watched in horror as the massive black wolf stood over Vaughn's broken body. The second enforcer, terrified, fumbled for his weapon, but the wolf turned those violet eyes on him and let out a roar that shook the snow from the trees. The enforcer didn't fight. He turned and fled, shifting into a brown wolf mid-stride, tail tucked between his legs. The black wolf didn't pursue. He turned slowly to Aara. His side was bleeding again, the wound reopened by the exertion. He limped toward her on the ice, his breathing ragged. "You," Aara whispered, staring at the blood on his muzzle. "You came for me." He had left the safety of the cave. He had fought for her. The wolf reached her and collapsed his strength, finally failing. He rested his heavy head on her uninjured leg, his eyes sliding shut. Aara forgot the cold. She forgot the pain in her ankle. She wrapped her arms around the massive, terrifying beast and buried her face in his fur, sobbing. "You stupid dog," she cried softly. You saved me." Getting back to the cave was a nightmare. Aara's ankle was swollen to the size of a melon, and the wolf, whom she had secretly started calling Shadow, was losing blood fast. He leaned heavily against her, his massive weight nearly crushing her, but together they limped through the snow, leaving a trail of red behind them. By the time they collapsed inside, the Fisher night had fallen. The temperature dropped, plummeting again. Aara didn't have the energy to build a fire, even if she had the wood. She dragged herself and the wolf to the back corner. She checked his wound again. The stitches she'd improvised had torn, but the bleeding was sluggish now. "Stay with me," she whispered, stroking his ears. "Don't you dare die on me now." She curled into his side, sharing their body heat. Exhaustion pulled her under, into a dreamless black sleep. She woke to heat. Not the gentle warmth of the wolf's fur, but a blazing, radiating heat that felt like a furnace next to her skin. And the texture had changed. It wasn't fur against her cheek anymore. It was skin. Smooth, hot skin. Aara stiffened. She slowly opened her eyes. The cave was dim, lit only by the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. But it was enough to see. The wolf was gone. Lying next to her with his arm draped protectively over her waist was a man. Aara scrambled back with a gasp, hitting the stone wall. The man groaned and sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. The movement rippled through muscles that looked like they were carved from marble. He was naked, utterly unashamed, and magnificent in a terrifying way. His skin was a deep olive, scarred in places with the white lines of old battles. A tattoo of a crown intertwined with thorns wrapped around his left bicep. His hair was black as midnight, falling messily over his forehead. But it was his eyes that stopped Aara's heart. Violet. Electric piercing violet. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and intelligent. "You're loud in the morning," he rasped. His voice was deep, a baritone that vibrated in the small space. It sounded like gravel crunching under tires. "You," Aara pointed a shaking finger at him. "You're the wolf." "I am," he said calmly. He shifted, wincing as he stretched his injured side. The wound was there on his human skin, an angry red gash, but it looked cleaner now. "You're a shifter," she breathed. "A rogue." A dark amusement danced in his eyes. "Something like that." He looked around the cave, his nose wrinkling. "This is a poor palace for a queen, but it saved my life. You have my thanks, little nurse." Aara pulled her knees to her chest, trying to look smaller. This man was dangerous. The power rolling off him in waves was suffocating. It was alpha power, but magnified by 1,000. It tasted like ozone and storm clouds. "I'm Aara," she whispered. "I know," he said. He leaned forward, ignoring her flinch, and reached out to tuck a strand of dirty hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly gentle. "I heard that filth Vaughn say your name before I ripped his throat out. You killed him," she said, the reality sinking in. "Marcus, Alpha Marcus will come for us. He'll send the whole pack." The man's expression darkened. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, archaic ruthlessness. "Let them come." He stood up, towering over her in the cramped cave. He didn't seem to care that he was nude. He carried himself with the arrogance of a king. "My name is Kalen," he said. Aara froze. The name hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Kalen. She had heard stories. Nursery rhymes whispered to scare pups into behaving. "Be good, or Kalen the Thorn will come for you." He was the alpha of the Obsidian Shadow Pack, the largest, most lethal pack on the continent. They said he was a monster who drank the blood of his enemies. They said he had no mate, no heart, and no mercy. "Kalen Thorn," she squeaked. He looked down at her, a faint smirk playing on his lips. The one and only. Aara felt the blood drain from her face. She had treated the Alpha King like a stray dog. She had scolded him. She had fed him scraps of rabbit. I didn't know, she stammered, lowering her head to bare her neck in submission. Forgive me, Alpha King. I didn't mean to disrespectful. A low growl rumbled in his chest, human but still feral. Stop that, he commanded. Aara flinched. Stop what? Baring your neck, looking at the floor, acting like a servant. He dropped to one knee in front of her, forcing her to look him in the eye. You saved my life, Aara. You dragged me out of the snow. You faced down 2 warriors to protect me when you could have run. You are no servant. He reached out and took her hand. His hand completely engulfed hers. Why? He asked, his voice softer, now probing. Why did they cast you out? You have the heart of a lioness. Aara looked at their joined hands. Because I'm weak, she whispered, the old shame burning her cheeks. I can't shift. My wolf. She never came. In Silverleaf, if you don't shift by 16, you're nothing. Marcus said, I was a waste of food. Silence stretched between them. Then Kaelin let out a breath that sounded like a hiss. Marcus Sterling is a fool, Kaelin said, his voice dripping with venom, and he has made a grave error. He's powerful, Aara warned. He has 200 wolves. I have an army, Kaelin replied simply, and I have a very long memory. He squeezed her hand. But first we must survive the day. My healing is slowed by the silver. I cannot shift again for at least 24 hours without risking permanent damage. And you? He looked at her swollen ankle. You cannot walk. So we're trapped, Aara said. No, Kaelin said. He moved closer, his violet eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. We are waiting. My Beta Riker will be tracking my scent. When he finds us, this mountain will belong to me. He paused his gaze, dropping to her lips, then back up to her eyes. Tell me, Aara, why does your scent calm me? Aara blinked. I don't know. I smell like dirt and pine needles. No, Kaelin murmured, leaning in until his forehead rested against hers. You smell like winter jasmine and rain. You smell like home. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. The mate bond. She had heard of it, but she thought it was a myth for people like her, wolfless broken things. But the way he was looking at her, as if she were the only source of light in the world. Kaelin, she whispered, I will not let them touch you again. He vowed, his voice a low rumble against her skin. I will burn Silverleaf to the ground for what they did to you, but right now, I need you to trust me. I trust you, she said, realizing with a jolt that it was true. Good. He pulled back slightly, his expression grim. Because someone is coming. Outside the cave, the wind carried a new sound. Not the clumsy footsteps of Vaughn and his crony. This was the rhythmic, disciplined marching of a dozen men. Marcus hadn't just sent a patrol. He had brought his personal guard. Come out, Aara! Marcus's voice boomed from the clearing below, amplified by the valley walls. We found Vaughn's body. We know you have a rogue in there. Give him up and I'll make your death quick. Kaelin stood up. He was injured, naked, and outnumbered. But as he turned toward the cave entrance, he didn't look like a victim. He looked like the devil himself, preparing to greet his guests. Stay behind me, Kaelin ordered, his voice, changing, becoming the voice of command that had led armies into slaughter. What are you going to do? Aara cried, trying to stand on her good leg. Kaelin glanced back at her, and a dark, terrifying smile spread across his face. I'm going to introduce myself. Aara held her breath, as Caelan Thorn stepped out of the fissure and into the biting cold. He was stark naked, his body a map of scars and muscle blood still drying on his flank. Yet he walked with such terrifying grace that he might as well have been wearing royal armor. 50 yards down the slope, Alpha Marcus Sterling stood with 12 of his best enforcers. They were armed with rifles and silver-tipped spears, laughing among themselves. "Well, look at this," Marcus sneered, his breath puffing in the icy air. "The runt found herself a boyfriend, a rogue who doesn't even have the decency to dress for his execution." The enforcers chuckled, raising their weapons. Aara dragged herself to the cave entrance, peering out from the shadows. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. "They're going to kill him," she thought. "He's injured. He can't fight 12 men." Caelan didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't shift. He simply stood there, the wind whipping his dark hair across his face, and looked down at them with those electric violet eyes. "Marcus Sterling," Caelan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the snow like a crack of thunder. "You have trespassed. You have hunted an innocent woman, and you have disturbed my rest." Marcus blinked, thrown off by the stranger's tone. It was the tone of a man used to being obeyed instantly. "Who do you think you are, rogue?" "Do you know who I am? I am the Alpha of Silverleaf." "Silverleaf," Caelan repeated, tasting the word like it was poison. "A minor pack, weak borders, poor leadership, and judging by your presence here, devoid of honor." Marcus's face turned purple. "Kill him. Fill him with silver." The enforcers leveled their rifles, fingers tightened on triggers. Aara screamed, "No!" trying to scramble out to cover him, but before a single shot could be fired, a strange sound cut through the air. It was a rhythmic thwop, 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 echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus looked up, confusion clouding his face. Suddenly, 3 black tactical helicopters crested the ridge, their searchlights blinding the group below. The snow whipped into a frenzy from the rotor wash. Ropes dropped, and figures clad in black tactical gear descended with inhuman speed. Simultaneously, the tree line around them erupted. Dozens of wolves, massive, armored, and disciplined, stepped out from the white mist. They didn't growl, they didn't bark. They simply formed a tightening circle, cutting off every escape route. On their tactical vests, a symbol was stitched in silver thread, a crown of thorns. Marcus's gun fell from his hand. His face went ashen white. The obsidian shadow. He whispered, his voice trembling. "The Royal Guard." The soldiers on the ground didn't aim at Caelan. They aimed at Marcus. A tall man with a shaved head and a scar running down his eye stepped forward from the line of soldiers. This was Riker the King's Beta. He walked past the Silverleaf wolves as if they were nothing more than annoying insects, and knelt in the snow at Caelan's feet, bowing his head low. "My king!" Riker said, his voice ringing with absolute reverence. "We tracked your signal. Forgive our delay." Caelan looked down at his Beta, then slowly turned his gaze back to Marcus. The realization hit Marcus Sterling like a physical blow. He staggered back, his knees hitting the snow. The arrogant Alpha, who had exiled Aara for being weak, was now shaking violently. "King!" Marcus choked out. "King Caelan!" Caelan began to walk down the slope. He moved slowly, limping slightly, but the menace rolling off him made the Silverleaf enforcers drop to their knees, heads bowed to the dirt in submission. Caelan stopped inches from Marcus. "You called her weak," Caelan said softly. "You stripped her of her coat. You sent her into the storm to die. And then you hunted her like sport." I didn't know," Marcus stammered, tears of terror leaking from his eyes. "Your Majesty, she is just a wolfless runt. A drain on resources. I was doing what was best for the pack." Smack. Kaelin's backhand was so fast it was a blur. It connected with Marcus's jaw with a sickening crack, sending the Alpha spinning into the snow. Marcus spat out blood and 2 teeth. "She saved my life," Kaelin roared his voice, finally breaking into the fury of the Alpha King. "While you sat in your warm hall drinking whiskey, she stitched my wounds with her own hands. She defended me against your filth when she had nothing but a rock." Kaelin grabbed Marcus by the throat and lifted him into the air with one hand, his feet dangling. "She has more heart in her little finger than you have in your entire bloodline." Kaelin tossed Marcus aside like a rag doll. He turned to Riker. "Take them," Kaelin ordered coldly. "Chain them. Drag them behind the trucks back to the Silverleaf pack house. I want every member of this pack to see what happens to those who offend the crown." "And the girl?" Riker asked, looking up at the cave entrance where Aara sat, stunned into silence. Kaelin's expression softened instantly. He turned and walked back up the slope, ignoring the pain in his side. He reached the cave and scooped Aara up into his arms, bridal style. "The girl," Kaelin said, pressing a kiss to her frozen forehead, "is coming home." The Silverleaf pack house had been seized. The Obsidian Guard patrolled the hallways, and the Silverleaf members huddled in the dining hall, terrified and whispering. Their Alpha was in chains in the dungeon, and the Alpha King had taken over the master suite. Aara lay in the center of the massive king-sized bed, surrounded by silk sheets that cost more than her entire life's earnings. Her ankle was wrapped in a high-tech brace, and she was warm, truly warm for the first time in years. But the atmosphere in the room was tense. Dr. Aris, the royal physician, stood by the bedside, holding a tablet with grim data. Kaelin stood by the window, now dressed in a black tactical suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He was staring out at the snowy grounds, his hands clenched into fists. "Tell me again," Kaelin growled, not turning around. "It's conclusive, Your Majesty," Dr. Aris said, adjusting his glasses. "I ran the blood tests 3 times. Aara isn't wolfless. She isn't a genetic failure." Aara sat up, her heart skipping a beat. "What but? I never shifted. My 16th birthday came and went. I felt nothing." Dr. Aris looked at her with pity. "You didn't shift, Miss Vance, because you were being poisoned." The room went silent. "Poisoned?" Aara whispered. "Wolfsbane mixed with a synthetic suppressor called Argentis," the doctor explained. "It's a rare, illegal compound used to keep high-level criminals from shifting in prison. It's been in your system for years, likely administered in small doses daily, in your food or perhaps your tea." Aara's mind raced. Every morning, the head Omega, a woman loyal to Marcus, gave her a special cup of herbal tea for her constitution. She said it was to help with her frailty. "They made me weak." Aara realized, her voice trembling with rage. "They did this to me on purpose." Kaelin turned from the window. His eyes were glowing so bright they looked like violet lasers. The air in the room grew heavy, the furniture rattling from the force of his aura. "Why?" Kaelin demanded. "Why suppress a random orphan girl?" "Because—" Dr. Aris hesitated, tapping the screen. "I ran a lineage test, too. She isn't a random orphan. Her DNA markers match the extinct Moonfall bloodline." Kaelin froze. "Moonfall, the White Wolf lineage." "Yes. Her parents weren't nobodies. They were the leaders of the resistance against the Rogue Wars 20 years ago. They were powerful. Alpha Marcus's father took them in, killed them, and enslaved their daughter. He knew if she ever shifted, her power would dwarf his own. She is a true Alpha, sir. By blood." Aara stared at her hands. She wasn't a mistake. She was a threat. "They stole my life," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. They treated me like a slave, mocked me, spat on me, all while terrified of what I could become. Kaelan crossed the room in 2 strides. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms. He didn't say a word. He just let her cry, absorbing her grief and her rage. "I will fix this," Kaelan vowed into her hair. "Dr. Aris, give her the antidote." "It will be painful," the doctor warned. "The suppression has built up for years. When the dam breaks, the shift will be violent." Aara pulled back, wiping her eyes. She looked at Kaelan. "I want to do it. Now." "Aara, you are still healing from the cold," Kaelan said gently. "I have been cold my whole life," she said, her voice hard as steel. "I want to burn. I want to see Marcus Sterling face me, not as the weak girl he threw out, but as the wolf he was too coward to let live." Kaelan searched her eyes. He saw the fire there, the same fire that had made her face a bear trap and a blizzard to save him. He nodded. "Do it." Dr. Aris administered the injection. For a minute, nothing happened. Then Aara screamed. It felt like her bones were snapping and reforming, like lava was being poured into her veins. Kaelan held her through every convulsion, whispering encouragement, anchoring her to reality. "Let it out, Aara!" he roared as her back arched off the bed. "Don't fight it, embrace it!" With a sound that shattered the windows of the master suite, Aara's body contorted. Fur erupted from her skin, not the grey or brown of a common wolf, but a blinding, pristine white. She grew, and grew. When the transformation was complete, a massive white wolf stood on the bed. She was nearly as large as Kaelan. Her eyes were a stunning crystal blue. She threw her head back and let out a howl, a sound of pure, unadulterated power that rang through the entire pack house, causing every wolf in a 5-mile radius to instinctively bare their necks. Kaelan smiled, a feral, proud thing. "Hello, my queen." The execution grounds of the Silverleaf Pack were little more than a muddy, frozen depression in the earth, ringed by ancient pines that had witnessed generations of violence. Today, however, the air didn't smell of pine or damp earth. It smelled of fear. Over 300 wolves had gathered. They stood in concentric circles, the terrified members of the Silverleaf Pack on the inside, shivering in their coats, and the lethal armored soldiers of the Obsidian Shadow Pack, forming an iron ring around them on the outside. The silence was absolute. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed against the eardrums. In the center of the mud, a wooden post had been driven into the ground. Chained to it was Alpha Marcus Sterling. The man who had once terrified Aara simply by walking into a room now looked pathetic. His fine clothes were torn, his face a canvas of purple bruises from Kaelan's interrogation. Beside him, bound in iron kneeling cuffs, were Vaughn's remaining enforcers, and Mrs. Halloway, the head Omega, who had poisoned Aara's tea for a decade. They kept their heads bowed, refusing to look at the crowd, trembling so violently their chains rattled like chimes in a breeze. The heavy oak doors of the pack house groaned open. Every head turned. A collective intake of breath sucked the air from the clearing. Kaelan Thorne stepped out first. The Alpha King wore a long military coat, blacker than the abyss, the silver buttons gleaming. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed forward, his expression carved from granite. He walked with a predator's grace to the edge of the stairs and stopped. He didn't descend. Instead, he turned slightly, extending a hand back toward the darkness of the hall. "Behold!" His voice boomed deep enough to vibrate in the chests of the onlookers. "The one you tried to break, the one you failed to kill." Aara Vance stepped into the light. If the pack was expecting the terrified, starving girl in the grey rags who had been cast out 3 days ago, they were disappointed. That girl was dead, Aara wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, heavy and regal, with a high collar that framed her face. A silver belt clinched her waist, carrying a ceremonial dagger. Her hair, once dull and brittle, now cascaded down her back in waves of lustrous chestnut, braided with silver wire. But it wasn't the clothes that made the pack members gasp and take a step back. It was her eyes. They were no longer the soft, frightened brown of a servant. They were a piercing, crystalline blue, the mark of the Moonfall bloodline. And the power radiating off her was a physical weight. It felt like standing next to a hydroelectric dam, a humming, crackling pressure of pure alpha energy that made the hairs on everyone's arms stand up. She descended the stairs, ignoring Kaelin's hand. She didn't need help. Not anymore. She walked through the parted crowd. Wolves who had once tripped her in the hallway or laughed when she dropped a tray now scrambled to get out of her way, dropping to their knees in the mud foreheads touching the ground. "Please, Aara," one woman whispered as Aara passed. "We didn't know." Aara didn't even look at her. She kept her eyes locked on Marcus. She reached the center of the circle and stopped 3 feet from the post. The mud tried to cling to her boots, but she stood rooted, immovable. Marcus looked up. His left eye was swollen shut, but his right eye widened in shock. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost. "You," Marcus rasped his voice, sounding like dry leaves. "You look like your mother." "Do not speak her name," Aara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the crowd with bell-like clarity. "You are not worthy to remember her." She turned, slowly addressing the Silverleaf pack. She saw the faces of her tormentors, her neighbors, her former friends, who had turned their backs. "For 10 years, Aara began, her voice steady. "I scrubbed your floors. I washed your clothes. I tended to your sick when the fever swept through the barracks. I gave you everything I had." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And when winter came, you let him—" She pointed a finger at Marcus without looking at him. "Strip the coat from my back. You watched him cast me out to die in the freeze. Not one of you spoke up. Not one of you offered a blanket. Why silence?" A shame so thick it was palpable hung over the crowd. "Because he told you I was weak," Aara answered for them. "He told you I was a genetic failure, a drain on resources." She spun around to face Marcus, her eyes flashing with blue fire. "Tell them, Marcus. Tell them why I never shifted. Tell them why I was weak." Marcus spat a glob of blood onto her boot. "Because you are a freak, a mistake." Aara signaled to Dr. Aris, who stood near the porch. The doctor stepped forward, holding up a vial of clear liquid. "This is Argentis," Aara announced, her voice rising. "A military-grade wolfsbane suppressor. For 10 years, Marcus ordered Mrs. Halloway to lace my morning tea with it. He didn't exile me because I was weak. He exiled me because he was terrified of what I truly am." A murmur of shock rippled through the Silverleaf wolves. Poisoning a pack member, especially a child, was a capital offense in wolf law. It was considered the act of a coward, not an alpha. "He stole my wolf," Aara roared, the velvet of her voice turning into a growl. "He stole my birthright, and he tried to steal my life. But he failed." She looked up at Kaelin, who was watching her with a mixture of dark pride and intense focus. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. "Unchain him," Aara commanded the guards. "No!" Mrs. Halloway shrieked from her knees. "He'll kill you. He's a killer. I said unchain him." Aara barked the alpha command in her voice, hitting the guards like a physical blow. They scrambled to obey, fumbling with the keys. The chains fell away. Marcus rubbed his raw wrists. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff limbs. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, and heavy with muscle even after days in a cell. He looked at Aara, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his broken face. "You stupid girl," Marcus sneered, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think because you shifted once you're an alpha, I've been fighting wars since before you were born. I won't just kill you. I'm going to tear that pretty dress off and make you watch while I take back my pack." Aara didn't flinch. She unbuckled her belt and handed her ceremonial dagger to a nearby guard. "I challenge you, Marcus Sterling," she declared, her voice ringing out like steel striking steel. "For the title of Alpha, for the crimes against my bloodline, to the death." "Accepted," Marcus hissed. He didn't wait for the signal. He was a dirty fighter, and he knew his only chance was surprise. Mid-sentence, Marcus's body cracked and contorted. In less than 2 seconds, a massive russet-colored wolf stood where the man had been. He launched himself at Aara jaws, snapping for her throat. The crowd screamed. Kalen took a step forward, his hands igniting with black energy, but he stopped himself. He had to let her do this. Aara didn't scream. She didn't run. As Marcus's jaws closed inches from her face, she dropped. It was a move of pure instinct. She slid onto her knees in the mud, arching her back, and as she did, the change took her. It was explosive. A blinding flash of white light, the sound of bone reshaping instantly. By the time Marcus landed and turned, he wasn't facing a woman in a velvet dress. He was facing the white wolf. She was magnificent. Standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, she dwarfed Marcus. Her fur was pristine, glowing with an ethereal luminescence, even under the grey sky. Her claws were black obsidian, digging deep into the frozen earth. Marcus hesitated. For the first time, genuine terror flickered in his eyes. The legend of the Moonfall line wasn't just a story. It was a nightmare standing in front of him. Aara didn't wait. She lunged. She moved with a speed that defied physics, a white blur against the brown mud. She slammed into Marcus broadside, the impact sounding like a car crash. Marcus was thrown 10 feet, tumbling through the mud, yelping as the air left his lungs. He scrambled up, snarling, and snapped at her legs. He was experienced using his lower center of gravity to try and hamstring her. His teeth grazed her flank, drawing a thin line of red blood against the white fur. The sight of her blood enraged Kalen's wolf, a low growl rumbling from the porch. But Aara was unbothered. The pain only sharpened her focus. She pivoted her heavy tail, whipping around to smack Marcus across the face, blinding him for a split second. Then she clamped her jaws onto the scruff of his neck. She didn't bite down. Not yet. She used her massive strength to lift him off the ground and slam him back down into the earth. Thud. She lifted him again. Thud. She was ragdolling him, humiliating him, showing the pack that their terrifying alpha was nothing more than a plaything to a true queen. Marcus panicked. He thrashed wildly, his claws raking uselessly against her thick chest fur. He managed to squirm free, scrambling backward, tail tucked between his legs. He looked toward the tree line. He was going to run. The coward was going to abandon his pack and flee. Aara let out a huff of breath that looked like steam. She crouched low. As Marcus turned to sprint, Aara unleashed the power of the moonfall. She didn't just run, she practically flew. She closed the distance in 3 bounds. She hit him from behind her paws, slamming into his spine. Marcus collapsed with a sickening crunch, paralyzed. Aara walked slowly around to face him. Marcus lay in the mud, wheezing, unable to move his back legs. He looked up at her, whining, baring his neck in the ultimate sign of submission. He was begging for mercy. The old Aara, the girl who saved spiders and stitched up wounded birds, might have hesitated. She might have shown mercy. But Aara looked at the pack house, She looked at the window of the attic room where she had shivered for 10 years. She looked at Mrs. Halloway who had poisoned her. She looked at the spot on the stairs where Marcus had laughed while she froze. Mercy for a monster is cruelty to his victims. Aara stepped forward, her blue eyes locked with his amber ones. She let him see the judgment there. For my parents, she projected the thought, knowing he could hear it in the mind link. And for the girl you killed, she lunged, her jaws closed around his throat. One sharp, decisive twist. Use! Marcus Sterling went limp. Aara released him, stepping back as his body shifted back into its human form, broken and lifeless in the mud. The silence that followed was deafening. No one breathed. No one moved. Aara lifted her muzzle to the sky. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cold air of freedom, and let out a howl. It wasn't a howl of mourning. It was a howl of victory, a song of reclamation. It started low and mournful, then rose to a crescendo that shook the snow from the pine trees. Seconds later, a deep, earth-shattering howl joined hers. Kaelin, and then another, and another. The Silverleaf wolves dropped to their stomachs, pressing their faces into the mud, joining the chorus. Then the Obsidian soldiers joined in. 300 wolves howled in unison, a symphony of power acknowledging the rise of a new alpha. Aara shifted. She stood naked in the steaming cold, her body heaving with adrenaline, blood not hers, smeared on her chin. Before the cold could bite her skin, a heavy black coat enveloped her. Kaelin was there. He wrapped his military coat around her, buttoning it with trembling fingers. He didn't care about the blood. He grabbed her face in his hands, his violet eyes searching hers. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. "No," Aara whispered, adrenaline crashing into exhaustion. She leaned her forehead against his chest, smelling his scent of storm and pine. "I'm free." Kaelin swept her up into his arms, lifting her high against his chest. He turned to the crowd, his face fierce with pride. "The usurper is dead," Kaelin roared. "Behold Aara Vance Alpha of the Silverleaf Pack, blood of the moon fall. Alpha Aara," the crowd chanted, the sound rhythmic and worshipful. "Alpha Aara." Kaelin looked down at her, the corner of his mouth crooking up in a smirk. "You realize," he murmured, so only she could hear, "that since I am the king and you are my mate, this makes you a queen. You outrank me in your own territory." Aara wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek and smiled, a dangerous, beautiful thing. "You better remember that, Wolf King. I bite." Kaelin laughed, a sound of pure joy that he hadn't made in years. He kissed her deep, and claiming right there in the middle of the blood and the mud, sealing their bond before the eyes of two armies. "Let's go home, my queen," he whispered against her lips. As he carried her back toward the warmth of the pack house, the sun finally broke through the heavy winter clouds. A single beam of golden light hit the snow, illuminating the path forward. The long winter of Aara's life was over. The spring had come, and with it, the reign of the White Wolf. That is the story of Aara and the Wolf King. It reminds us that sometimes the people society casts aside are the ones holding the greatest power. Aara was called weak, but her kindness was her greatest strength, and it won her a kingdom. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, romance, and justice, please give this video a big thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new story. And tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven the pack or would you have burned it all down? I'll see you in the next video.